This week on The Futurists, Theo Priestley.
What kind of world does that leave us for people if that level of automation is running rampant in the world? And I think this is the thing that keeps me up at night at the moment.
Hey, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek, and I'm with my co-host, Brett King, dialing in from Chicago. How you doing, Brett?
Yeah, I got a bit of a cold today. I don't know, maybe it's because the cold, the windy city. It was a cold out last night when I was walking home. Maybe that's why. But
the most miserable weather in the world.
Pretty much. Yeah.
I used to live there, and it's like summer is a month long. It's a nice.
Well, have you ever tried living in London?
Yeah, but London's got London, so there's more there to benefit from than just the weather. Yeah, Speaking of which, one of our jobs on this show is to bring people who are thinking about the future in fresh and interesting ways, and that's why we reached out to Theo Priestley to join us. Theo, welcome to the show.
Brett, Robert, thank you for having me. And if we're talking about the weather, then we all know, if you can tell from my accent, I'm from Scotland, and we have the best weather in the entire world. It's like 4 seasons in one day.
That's true. What city are you in? Edinburgh?
I'm in Edinburgh, yeah.
Yeah, right on. Great. That's a great town. Good to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us. I've been checking out your Medium posts, which I found very interesting. One of the things I like about you is that you're willing to do a thing that a lot of people are cautious about. You're willing to put ideas out there that aren't fully baked. You're willing to think about it in an interesting way. That's real fun for our audience to listen to and hear about. Tell us a little bit about what you do as a futurist, your approach to thinking about the future.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of fell into the whole futurist thing. I've been writing, if we go all the way back, I've been collecting comics and science fiction since I was a child. I have bookshelves filled with science fiction. And in fact, if you remember the old analog pulp science fiction magazines from the 50s and 60s, I have 600 copies, all the way dating back from the 50s all the way up to 2010s. And I just found myself immersed in science fiction and always thinking about what's coming next kind of thing. And it wasn't until I was deathly bored doing business transformation kind of projects that I just found myself, writing about what was actually happening on the ground versus what the analysts were talking about. And that just led me to exploring, what I like to think about in a sense. And like you say, I in my writing, it's very conversational. I wear my heart on the sleeve, and I don't really care if I write something and it's complete and utter hogwash at the time and completely unformed, because I want to spark the conversation with other people to think about the what if and he's wrong because, or he's right because, and it's the conversational piece and that kind of spark that I really want other people to take hold of and run with. So I've got no idea how many startup ideas could be sitting in my old blogs, but if someone looked at it and thought, that's a great idea, I'm going to run with it and see where it goes, good on them. All the best to you. And I hope you raise money and I hope you're a success. But at the time, I just didn't have a clue what the hell I was talking about.
But that's how ideas get started. You were just mentioning before we started recording that you were looking back at some of your old blogs from a few years ago, and you saw combinations of ideas that at the time they seemed like science fiction, but today they're becoming increasingly realistic. It's increasingly probable. And candidly, that's what futurism is.
I always, I say often, because obviously I'm a sci-fi fan as well. But I will often describe the role of a futurist as short-term science fiction. Right? There is science to it, but and because it's not yet alive and implemented, it can be considered fictional. So the sci-fi guys just tend to be longer term. If you look at a lot of the sci-fi that there's written today, that's the big space opera stuff. It's maybe 10,000 years in the future, or an undetermined period, millennia in the future. Because it's hard, as William Gibson said, it's harder to write stuff that's near-term future today because things are changing so rapidly.
So I think it's so bizarre. Like the present that we're in sounds like a science fiction story to begin with, with all kinds of, just look at any newspaper. The one difference, I think, we bring a lot of science fiction into the show. It comes up in just about every other episode. We are either talking to a science fiction writer or someone who is profoundly influenced by sci-fi, like you are. It comes up a lot because I think that that's our habit, right? As people, we like to tell stories. What futurists do, or what forecasters do, is they do scenario planning. And what is scenario planning if it's not storytelling, right? We posit a scenario and then we start to tell a narrative about it. The difference is sci-fi writers do it in a more interesting and accessible and exciting way. It's more relatable, and no surprise, they're better storytellers. So maybe futurists are just boring science fiction writers.
That's one way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, we write research reports, and unfortunately, it's not peppered with interesting characters, is it?
Yeah, we have to ground it in like analytics and data and make it seem more plausible that way. I was just noticing one of the authors that comes up quite often in the show is Robert Heinlein. And in 1949, he wrote a book that I thought was incredibly relevant. And I want to bring it up. It's called The Man Who Sold the Moon. And if you haven't read it, it's a short story. It's a short book. It's actually quite a fun book because it's about privatized space. And he wrote it in 1949 when we really didn't have a space program. So that's pretty awesome forecasting, or awesome vision. And the character in it is a character named Delos Harriman, who's this ambitious kind of hard-charging business executive. And it's all about how you would go about the process of privatizing space. Now, that story today, when you look back at it, you go, like, well, there's a blueprint. There's a he set forth a plan, or a vision, an architecture for someone to go fill. And today it's entrepreneurs like Richard Branson, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, who are attempting to fill those shoes and privatize space. You've written quite a bit about this topic. What's your take about the privatized space race?
We're in an interesting time because although the privatization side has opened up lots of opportunities for smaller companies to essentially take a crack at it, get funding, there's a very small amount of people, or certainly companies, with the required amount of funding to actually make a difference and actually become successful. And obviously one of those at the top of the mind is SpaceX. And if you actually look at where SpaceX has come, privatization has almost led to a monopoly now, where almost nobody can actually touch SpaceX. You have Rocket Lab and other people like that, but really in reality, who are people turning to? Because SpaceX has not only the rockets, but the rocket cadence, or the launch cadence, but also the success.
Yeah.
And if you are doing a multi-million or hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of research and development to launch something in space, you're going to turn to someone who has the success criteria to put it into orbit or to send it to another body. You are not going to take the risk on something like a 3D printed rocket that didn't make the second stage, for example. And so there is a huge gulf in terms of the privatization between companies who are wannabes.
Monopoly right now.
And we're in a monopoly, like you say. I mean, and you've got the dreamers as well, which is great to dream. I mean, obviously science fiction fuels that, and people want to mine asteroids and things like that. But realistically, how far away are we from ever reaching an asteroid to bring something back? Even the smallest amount. No, we haven't.
Well, we did do a sample return. We've done one sample return mission from an asteroid, but there is.
It's not a business.
But space is more accessible now, and that's the thing that it will change. The cost to orbit. Right now, I think SpaceX is running it at $1,100 per kilogram to orbit. Starship will get that down to around $100 kilogram to orbit. The space shuttle was $30,000, and the Apollo was $50,000. So, space is a lot more accessible just because of that lowering of the cost. But as Elon will argue, it happened because of first principles thinking and engineering.
And
but there's a whole lot of the
like,
space industry that
let's get real. NASA was loaded with engineers, but they never managed to achieve. They were never able to drive that cost curve down the way he seems to be able to. And like you say, Theo, it's self-reinforcing. Now I think NASA is entirely dependent on SpaceX to get things into orbit or to get them to the space station. What's going on with the space station right now? Because it seems like this little island of cooperation between the United States, Russia, and other nations, where we're kind of all on the planet's surface. We're all caught in geopolitical conflict right now, and everybody's opposing each other. but it seems like cooperation still continues in space. Is that true?
Did I not read that the Russians want to pull back, and certainly the Chinese have their own space station anyway, and they don't really want anything to do with it. So, and of course, the space station is now, they're already talking about either throwing it back down or chucking it into a higher orbit to do something else, and so that's reaching at the end of its useful lifespan.
Yeah.
And
it's kind of like an antique at this point, right? It's
absolutely.
Well, it's what is it? 35 years old?
Yeah,
40 years old.
Like parts are breaking and wearing out and so on.
Yeah.
They just a couple of Russian cosmonauts just moved the radiator out onto the wing today or something. They just did a spacewalk a few hours ago.
Yeah, but I mean, you've got talking about privatization again. You've got Sierra Space, who's obviously doing some work with closely with NASA to start building modules for the next generation of space station. And you've got other people who want to put, Blue Origin or whatever, want to put up commercialized space stations, which I find quite an odd idea. Who's wanted to send an email or a fax from from a space station, or sending your exec up in space to do space meetings and then bring them back down? It's kind of like a weird use case, let's put it that way. But our next step is obviously sending up another replacement space station, and of course that's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars at this stage. But like Brett said, it's accessibility. Go on.
Sorry, the next space station is going to be at the Lagrange point around the in lunar orbit, isn't it?
Yeah, they're talking about Gateway, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. But the thing is that to me, and this is the thing that obviously it's all down to cost, money, etc. To me, to actually bin the current space station entirely, rather than push that out into further orbit and act as a kind of midway point if it needs to be, or even push it out towards Mars or something like that, and actually have it as some kind of a science station that could be parked in another orbit, just seems to be a real waste of opportunity, I think. But obviously, I'm not in charge.
What would be a better use? What would be a better thing to do? Because if they don't do something, it's going to come crashing back down to the
well,
surface.
they're talking of actually giving it a gentle push rather than it coming crashing down. So they actually want to actively decommission it and deorbit it. And I think there's probably more value in trying to just push it into another orbit or even
it takes
between
so much,
CIS.
Yeah, it takes so much effort to get it into low Earth orbit. What's 100 tons, or I don't know the weight of it now, but why would you, if it hasn't completely failed, why wouldn't you continue to make use of it? Yeah. If you could commercialize it, you could have SpaceX take over the administration of it and running it. SpaceX is now getting involved in a mission potentially to service the Hubble, which they'd sort of written off. So Jared Isaacman, who was the first private flight that they did, what do they call it, the Endeavour. I can't remember now, but he's looking at doing something with the Hubble. So SpaceX is a logical partner. No, they've had.
Let's talk about the other firms that are in the space besides SpaceX. Let's talk about some of the other firms. Virgin Orbit notably just went belly up. Right, they're auctioning that off next month. That was they say that was a private space company that could never find a business model. And Theo, to your point, they were trying to find a way to fit into the market space of offering privatized launch services of some kind, for companies that didn't maybe want to deal with SpaceX or Blue Origin or any of the other leading companies. But they never managed to find like a product market fit. And as a result, they went bankrupt a month ago, and now they're likely to get sold off on the chopping block next month. What's happening in the UK? You've written about the UK companies, but you've been quite critical about the UK's approach to privatized space. Yeah,
I mean, the UK is famous for, I think, trying to stand toe-to-toe with the US market and certainly the European market, but it's never had the funding behind it. I mean, if you look at some of the announcements made by the UK Space Agency, for example, it's like, 2 million we've raised, there's a £2 million grant, and it's like, well, that's great. And then it's like, but spread across 60 companies over the next 3 years. And it's like, what? I'm giving you $20,000. I could get a loan for that then. That's the kind of effort I think that the UK likes to talk about. And it's the same with AI as well. They always boast about some huge inordinate amount of money, but it's spread over a long period of time, and it has to be spread over a certain number of companies, and then it becomes very diluted in that sense in terms of the real impact that money can do. And this is why companies like Orbex, for example, or Deorbit is another one. Although Deorbit's got a place in the UK, but I don't think it's fully UK. I think it's Italian. But Orbex, for example, was started in Scotland, and they're another sort of launcher, and they've had to raise outside. They've raised significant capital outside, and they're close to doing something in terms of their first launch and building their first rocket, etc. But I think even them, they are considering heave-hoing the UK and then going to Europe, taking their operations solely in Europe. So it's
is this partly because of Brexit? Is this partly because of Britain's isolated at this point?
I think it's part and part. I think Brexit's had an enormous impact on just basically entrepreneurship and the availability of money within the country itself. But I think there's a certain amount of stagnation in terms of ambition. You can raise pre-seed money up to a point, and then you have to go elsewhere to become successful and scale. And certainly in the space industry, you need that scale. You need that scale of money and the availability of talent. And what the UK has become is essentially a data service center for satellites. That's the only thing that we've become good at, which is trying to build the service model to take data from satellites and then sell it on. But what we're, in some shape or fashion, and fashion a business model out of that and sell it to insurance companies or whatever. What we've found and what I'm seeing now is that that's starting to implode because nobody wants to buy data that you can get from Google Maps. You're essentially trying to sell Google Maps and monetize the same kind of data.
Part of the issue is also is that if you look at the addressable market for space transportation, you have the smaller operators, Relativity, Firefly, Rocket Lab, so forth. But a lot of these are now pushing into larger, launch platforms because there's not a huge small market for microsats and things like that. It tends to be buyers of space time, in terms of getting rockets into space, tending to launch commercial communication satellites, and things like this that require just bigger platforms and bigger budgets. Although there is the technology shrinking those down to some extent as well.
So does that mean that there's a natural tendency towards monopoly? I mean, this seems like this particular moment in history seems like a time where tech monopolies are finding that at great scale, they can dominate new niches without any effort. We're certainly seeing that in artificial intelligence, large language models. There's an infrastructure and hosting costs for that are tremendous to train those big models. Seems like something similar is arising in space based on what you're telling me, that just the launch cost alone means that the industry is going to consolidate around a handful of players. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I think I saw Space Capital talking around the fact that I think there's between 160 to 200 launch type services that are in various stages, whether inception or serious funding, and they're expecting that to consolidate or certainly disappear and be chopped down to about 30 by the end of the decade. And that and again we have to sort of talk about the SpaceX monopoly here. Is that the fact that they're so aggressive in bringing down the costs means that any small or younger company has to compete with that cost. To per kilogram to launch to orbit. And not only that, is again success factor, the fact that you can ride share on a larger vehicle now like Starship is more attractive because you can accommodate multiple projects, and like Brett's saying, the miniaturization of some satellites means that you can actually send up either larger payloads of smaller projects, again, multiple satellites all at once, rather than rely on the people that I think Virgin Orbit were trying to do, especially for the horizontal launch, which was always a bit of an anomaly in terms of launch type capabilities. Firing a missile from the back of a
Well, it's how
or
the
underneath the wing.
X-15 launched in the days gone by, but it was all suborbital.
Yeah,
So,
So with the CubeSats,
I mean, we are literally now, a day away from, this episode will air after the first orbital flight test of Starship, which is pretty huge. There's a lot happening next week, actually, as well. There's a Japanese company that is going to attempt the first private company to land on the surface of the moon. It's the Hakuto R spacecraft from a company called iSpace. So they're looking to land on the moon on April 25th, actually. Mm-hmm. So there's still a lot happening in the space. There's more happening in the space industry today than there was during the Apollo time, really.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. There's more than two players in the space. And then with China entering, there's going to be competition again. It's weird. The geopolitical competition actually spurs innovation, right? It's space race is a form of war, right? It's a form of geopolitical conflict, just taken up a level, I suppose. So that will add a little competitive zest to it. But what we're starting to see is that the private space companies, they become geopolitical actors as well. SpaceX has played a significant role in the Ukraine conflict. And just this week, there's been news about Russians trying to hack into the SpaceX, into their CubeSat network to interfere with the operations there. Because they're giving internet access and guidance to Ukrainian forces, so the Russians very much want to stop that, and Russia and China have let it be known that they have a way to destroy those CubeSats. In other words, they're targets. They're considered legitimate targets of warfare. Fortunately, we haven't seen any of that yet, though the Chinese have demonstrated that they can destroy a satellite. Like they've already demonstrated that capability.
Well, both Russia and China have. The problem with that is it creates space junk.
Yeah.
And that's dangerous. It could make near Earth orbit untenable over time, so but
and that space junk stays in orbit.
Have you heard about the Pez dispenser for Starship, Robert?
No.
So the Pez thing where you get your little they basically created a satellite launcher for the Starship to launch the Starlink Series 2 satellites out of the Starship. So
so it can just pop them out one by one, you mean? That's what you're saying with the Pez dispenser. Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah, that's not well, listen, their vision is to quadruple the size of Starlink. That's a lot. We're talking thousands of satellites that'll be launched. And SpaceX is not the only company. Blue Origin wants to do the same thing, right? So they're seeking to replicate that.
Yep.
You can imagine tens of thousands of CubeSats. And this is making some people crazy because it's not just space junk. It also gets in the way of observation, the ability to see what's going on in space from ground installations and observation posts. Hey, we're going to probably need to take a break here. And what we tend to do when we do the show, Theo, is we like to get to know our audience. We like our audience to get to know our guest a little bit better. And to do that, we ask a series of short questions. So these are short answer questions, more about you and how you got into futurism. Hey, Brett, take it away. Ask the short questions. We'll go to break.
All right, this is the lightning round. What was the first science fiction you remember being exposed to?
Oh, wow. I think it has to be Star Trek. I remember it running home when I was at primary school, coming out of school about 3:30 in the afternoon, running home, having dinner, and there was a black and white portable in the kitchen, and Star Trek was on at 6 o'clock on BBC Two.
I remember watching Star Trek on black and white in my dad's office, on the black and white. So, get that. What technology do you think has most changed humanity?
Oh, it has to be the internet. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, it literally was a black swan event that nobody could have really predicted. And of course, it just took it by storm. Has it changed it in good and bad ways? Yes, it has. But the one that's had the most profound effect, definitely the internet.
And name a futurist or a sci-fi author, entrepreneur that has influenced you and why.
Oh, good question there. So one of my favorite authors is Frederick Pohl. Old sort of 1950s, 60s science fiction writer, and he wrote a book called Gateway, and today it's still one of my favorite books because it combines kind of future gaze towards what humanity is like, the discovery of an alien civilization and fast travel to the stars in a completely different way. And the fact it has a robotic psychotherapist called Sigmund Freud is especially interesting because the story is told through some of his sessions.
It's like that depressed robot on Redshift, was it? Or Red Dwarf? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
What I was just thinking about is how
series.
funny it is. We need to put context around these science fiction authors like Frederick Pohl, or earlier I mentioned Robert Heinlein, because for a new generation, these are names from the ancient past. They're not about the future at all. They're about the 1950s. There was a time where you could read everything in science fiction when we were kids. You could be familiar with all the authors, Andre Norton and so forth, Ray Bradbury.
Asimov. Yeah.
But unfortunately, now it's expanded. And now every sci-fi author writes a series of books. It's not a single book. They're writing a multi-part series. So they're absorbing more and more of your attention. All right, let's go to break. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back after this with more from Theo Priestley on the Futurists.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific, and the Fintech 5. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network, and Next Gen Banker. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. Welcome back to the Futurists. I am your host, Brett King, with my co-host, Rob Tercek, and we have Theo Priestley, the futurist, on the spot for today in the hotspot. Theo, when do you identify yourself as a futurist, or is that sort of something that other people gave you the moniker of?
I think it's more something that other people kind of started to call me just because of my writing and what I started to speak about in general. I mean, I'd always looked at emerging technology trends, and for a while I worked as a chief of technology evangelist and for a software company, and it was my role to kind of project forward to clients and to the external market, what these trends looked like and where they were going to converge, what it was going to mean for like their businesses, etc. And I think, like I said right at the start, I think I kind of fell into the futurist kind of tagline more than anything else. It wasn't something that I officially studied or gained a qualification in, and it's something that I don't think you need to have a qualification in. It's definitely a mindset, and I've spoken to numerous children or teenage people who have that kind of mindset, and I'd love to see them coming into this profession more so than the old grey hairs that we have on here today.
I think one of the things our audience is interested in is methodology. We like to think about, we have to learn about how do you think about the future. You talked about a couple of methods. One is that you read science fiction, you think about alternative scenarios. Another one is that you blog ideas that aren't fully baked. So you're putting your ideas out there to the public to get some feedback. What are your other methodology? How do you follow trends? How do you keep up with all the different things that are changing? Do you have some particular process for that?
So so on the current side of things, obviously I use social media an awful lot to actually listen to what is going on. And then I project backwards in terms of what has happened in the past that we could potentially relate to what's happening today, to try and find a correlation, to project forward a few years and see where it could go. What are the effects on people? What are the effects on society at large? What happened in the past that could be projected on top of business? And would this current trend necessarily track the same way. So it's almost like a weird, tangle of combinations of things, of different types of methodologies that I'd rather cherry pick from rather than follow one specifically. It was like back in the day, 25 years ago, when I used to do Lean and Six Sigma in business transformation.
Just kill me.
Oh, I used to do COBOL as well. That's even worse. But there are a lot of purists out there, and they're like, no, you must follow this, green belt and then black belt, and we must drill down to the nth degree to find the patterns and things like that. And Lean, you have various methodologies in Lean, Kanban, Kaizen, etc., etc. And I was more akin to, well, I'll take that piece from Lean's, Six Sigma, and I'll take that piece from Lean and I'll mash them together, and actually I'll get the result that I want. Well, not the result I want. I wasn't like trying to manufacture the result, but come to the methodology that works for the particular scenario that I was working in. And it's far more effective, I find, especially in futurism, to kind of use a combination of different methodologies and different methods and research styles.
How important is timeline? We had a guest on recently who talked about Ray Kurzweil, and one of the points Kurzweil always makes is that timeline matters, that you need to time your predictions. You can't just make forecasts because, someday we'll all take vacations on Mars.
But we've had some futurists that don't, right?
That's right. Some people
they don't want to stick to a timeline. Yeah.
And I think that's kind of bogus, candidly. It's like, what kind of futurist are you if you can't put a date on your prediction?
Yeah. I'm of that kind of sort of ilk, where it's like, if you can at least sort of hang your hat on something, and even if you're wrong, you can always readjust your forecasting. That's the thing. Whereas if you don't hang your hat on a date, then you can say, oh, I said this would happen, and when did you say it, and when was it supposed to happen? So
and to Kurzweil's credit,
the definition of a futurist,
and actually his predictions, when they come true, they're you can say he predicted this would happen by this date. And generally speaking, he's pretty accurate, relatively speaking. I would say he's pretty accurate. Not as accurate as he claims.
No, I was going to say, Theo, the definition of a futurist?
What is there a real definition of a futurist?
That's my definition. Never being wrong today. Robert's heard that about 60 times, I think.
Yeah, great. It keeps getting better, though, so keep going with that. So, Theo, when you look out at the landscape today, you look at the news, you watch what's happening in socials, you're thinking about the future, what gets you excited? Like, what are the trends now where you say, oh, that's cool, that's something I want to explore, I want to learn more about that?
So one of a couple of the trends, ones we've already covered in extensive detail, which is space, because you can see that the common good that will happen in the future if we do it the right way. The other one, which really still fascinates me, is, and it might cause people to sort of roll eyes and groan, is not only Web3 but the Metaverse as well. So Web3, I fundamentally believe that it's a shift that will run alongside the old web until a point where you can either make a choice of which web you want to live in. Is it a decentralized web, or is it the one that we grew up, or some of us grew up with? And I do believe some of the core tenets of decentralization, data sovereignty, etc., will actually extend into our lives. And one of those, again, I went back to check on old blogs, and one of those was like, how do we use those kind of blockchain and decentralized technologies to ensure data sovereignty when we look at the artificial intelligence trend, and stop the data scraping, and how do I protect my identity? For example, we're seeing people's identity now being cloned, voices, likenesses, etc. So there's some exciting technologies there. And then the metaverse is something, I think, once we get past it looks like Roblox, it looks like Fortnite stage, and actually understand that it is multifaceted realities that work all together at the same time, then there are some really exciting things that could happen with that technology as well. And then, of course, you have the convergence. A lot of these times people go, people think of them as very siloed trends, and they're not. They're at some point they will all converge.
They accelerate each other, right? So all the technologies you just mentioned rely on one common piece of core infrastructure, which is microprocessors. And the big advances now in semiconductors are happening in graphical processing units, GPUs. Now it's CPUs. And
that's
the GPU
where
is
Moore's
great.
law has shifted to now. GPUs.
It's shifted exactly. So the advances in GPU are driving parallel processing, right? That's what you use a GPU for. You can't use it for a single-threaded process the way you use a CPU. Parallel processing advances things like artificial intelligence, particularly large language models and deep learning, real-time 3D graphics, which is really relevant to things like the metaverse and games. And then, of course, crypto mining, right? So these three fields benefit from parallel processing, and the cost and the performance of those GPUs is dropping, right? So your price performance index is improving constantly, meaning basically a dollar of money, a dollar of computing gets cheaper or more powerful each year, every 18 months or so. That means that as things get cheaper, we're going to use more of it. So it's easy to make a forecast here that you say, okay, the things that GPUs power, which is 3D, crypto, or blockchain broadly, and artificial intelligence, particularly deep learning. Those three things, we're going to use a lot more of them because the cost of it's going to go down. One of the big impediments to crypto in general and any kind of blockchain consensus-based Web3 activity is that it was the cost of computing was expensive. You remember a few years ago, people were complaining that we were, melting the earth or burning up the environment because of all the crypto mining that was going on.
Bitcoin mining. Yeah.
But that's gradually going away as an issue. Today, arguably, that complaint has shifted over to large language models, which are equally environmentally destructive if you want to use that lens. But that issue is going to go away over time as the cost of compute goes down and processing power gets greater. It'll consume less resources. And of course, the algorithms get more efficient as well. So those three things are going to reinforce each other. And that's where it gets really exciting to see those three trends converge.
So even, when we talk about Apple's launch of their smart glasses platform, you can see, smart glasses are a natural device for marrying with a personal AI. We know where it's responsive to your communication, your behaviors, and so forth. I definitely see those two technologies converging.
Yeah, that's the spatial computing that I think we were promised maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah. And especially from the personal assistant point of view, what Google, Amazon, Siri, Apple all promised us from their personal assistants, which were pretty much stunted until these large language models have come along. To your point, Robert, about chips, there's some really interesting things happening right now. So there's obviously neuromorphic, which is essentially, mapping the algorithmic, how the calculations and the algorithms work according to how the brain works. But now we're seeing something called organoid intelligence, which is essentially putting human stem cells onto chips to make them more efficient at processing. Now, who's to say in the next, and then you've got BCI, brain computer interfacing as well on top of that. Now, who's to say that the whole idea of, in terms of Ray Kurzweil's singularity isn't going to happen or is going to happen potentially faster because of some of these outlier breakthroughs. Organoids, for example, on chips could lead to more integrated or organic means to plug ourselves into or have a chip implanted in our brain, which leads to us becoming part of the singularity that Ray was talking about, that was going to happen in the 2050s or 2060s. So
we are the Borg.
Yeah,
he made the forecast, and he didn't necessarily say how it was going to come about. He just said what's going to happen, and the how is up for grabs. But what both of you just mentioned, both Brett and Theo mentioned, is this role of the human being in this process. So we tend to think of this stuff as isolated from us. It's out on the cloud. It's out on a computer. It's it's distant from us. We use it. We're the beneficiary of it, but it's not about us, right? But the reality, when you think about AI in the context of augmented reality, what it really means is the human beings are the sensors for the network. We're the ones walking around with the gear and we're collecting the data. We do it today. This Apple Watch is collecting data for Apple's intelligence right now. And when I have goggles on my head that are gathering data about the world around me, basically I'm being the eyes and ears for the robot, right? For the AI. It'll collect data based on my behavior and my motion as I go through time and space.
But there's another trend apart from Moore's law. The overarching trend is that computers have got easier to use and have been made more accessible as the technology has improved. But ultimately, the ultimate version of that, right, is that computing is just built into the world around you, but the responsiveness to you as an operator individually requires it to be personalized. It requires adaptation to your behavior, your styles. And
I think that's why ChatGPT is the most successful consumer app launched in the last 10 years, and it's grown so fast because, like, for once, people can deal with an AI directly. And we've been working with AI. We've been using AI in search and maps and translation and so forth. You know, even the way movies are recommended to you on Netflix, there's artificial intelligence and all that, but consumers don't really see that. We don't have any experience of that. But for the first time ever, ChatGPT made it possible. You know, inside of OpenAI, there was a little bit of a debate there, right? Because the artificial intelligence researchers, which form the core of that organization, they didn't want to release it to the consumer public. They wanted to keep it a large language model as something that the researchers could use or that industry could use. But Sam Altman pushed for it. And overnight, this organization went from being, you know, a kind of a research facility to running the most popular consumer app right now on the planet, the hottest consumer app on the planet. People are really responding to it. So it's your point, but computers are going to get easier to use because we're going to be able to talk to them. We won't need to program them or speak to them in a specialized language or memorize commands and so forth.
Go full futurist on us, Theo. What do you think the world's going to be like with these technologies in the world? You know, how do you think about our daily lives in this future world?
You know, if I was going to go full futurist and say 2050 or 2060, for example, then I think, you know, we are going to have the kind. I would like to see us lose our dependence on the mobile phone, and the mobile phone is replaced by these personalized assistants in a sense. So, you know, the old Star Trek communicators where you just tap it and you're like, hey, do something for me, blah blah blah. And it spawns numbers of agents, little automated agents that run away in the background and perform the tasks and then come back and tell me what it's done. I see that as being far more, again, intuitive a world to live in than us being tied to a particular screen or device. And it feels very much like Her, that movie with Joaquin Phoenix, for example. But what kind of world does that leave us for people if that level of automation is running rampant in the world? And I think this is the thing that keeps me up at night at the moment. And I might go full futurist, but also contrarian here in the sense that, are we letting this technology run far ahead of us without actually understanding exactly what the impact is? So, I mean, Goldman Sachs has said 300 million jobs potentially are at risk. Most of them are white collar, granted. But 300 million equates to 1 in 10. Now, that's quite a high proportion when you think about the global workforce. 1 in 10 are going to lose their jobs. So to me, that's structural unemployment that we've not seen at a level before.
But hang on, do you really think that's plausible? Because
I do.
There's two responses to that. The first thing is a healthy economic environment is about destroying jobs. That's the essence of productivity growth. It's what we've been doing for 300 years since the Industrial Revolution. But the second thing is, we've been hearing this prediction for years. Every time there's been an innovation in the computing industry, it's going to destroy jobs. It's going to destroy jobs. Turns out people are pretty adaptable. And human beings are pretty good.
Yeah, but we've never had a tech. We've never had a tech that can simultaneously destroy many jobs across many industries at the same time. That's the difference, right?
Yeah,
Although, is it going to do it though? Because listen, I've talked to attorneys about ChatGPT, and they're like, yeah, it might be something I can use as an assistant. It's not going to replace an attorney. You're not going to hire ChatGPT to argue.
Not ChatGPT, but what comes in 5 years or 10 years? You know,
I think
that's not destroying jobs all at once, as you just said, right? So that you just undermine your argument, and I think that's the right way to think about it.
Yeah, potentially, but there's an all at once when we say all at once, I think when you look at the Industrial Revolution and things like that, that all at once turned into 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
50 years.
And slowly people filled the gaps that were left behind with different types of jobs. What AI does is actually disrupt that timeline and concatenates it, or whatever you want to call it, truncates it into, a space of single digit years rather than 20, 30 years kind of thing. And society and governmental policy and fiscal policy and everything else is not geared up to accept it, and two, to move to counter it. So if you have 300 million, the thing is as well is that 300 million is a starting point, because as these things get more intelligent, and you essentially remove rungs of the career ladder in various industries, what you find is the ones that are left are essentially going to be there purely to train the algorithm to get better. So you're left, your knowledge and your experience will slowly be sucked into the machine, as it were, to train it to get better, until the point is that it will, let's put it this way.
Theo, I hear you. And I'm often the person on this show who is expressing the most pessimistic viewpoint. This time, amazingly, I'm on the opposite side of the table. And I'm like, look, humans can adapt. People can learn these skills. Right now, there is no AI that's going to replace anybody. Just to talk about what's happening today. You're right. In the future, there might be some super fantastic AI that does replace jobs, but that is not the case. There's in a single profession, from any, code writing and so forth. What the AIs generate today requires a human with expertise to come in and double check. Now, your point about knocking out rungs on the ladder, the career ladder, that's a valid point, right? As a system starts to absorb more information, and maybe one or two expert people keep their jobs, but fewer new people are hired into those professions. But those new people are going to move into other fields. They're going to move into other kinds of jobs. And I think the potential for AI to create new jobs is going to exceed, and actually not just create new jobs, but confer superpowers on people. Because you'll have all that intelligence at your disposal as a tool to use. It's a new kind of job. We'll have to have a new kind of skill set, but humans are pretty adaptable, and we're very good at coming up with new needs. 15 years ago, nobody knew they needed a social network. 20 years ago, nobody knew they needed a smartphone. We're incredibly good at generating new needs that we never knew human beings required. So here I am being the optimist for once, Brett. I love it. This is sitting in your chair for once.
I know. But did you? I don't know if you've heard Chamath. What's his family name? Yeah, Palpatia. He's speaking about the challenge to VCs right now. Is that you used to deploy $20 to $30 million on a startup to get their labor force up to scratch so they could get their minimum viable product. And he's like, with AI, I need 3 or 4 people. Right. So we are already starting to see investment cycles that are changing because of that. I personally think I have a slightly different approach to this. I think climate is going to produce all the jobs we need. I don't think it's AI is going to produce new jobs. I think the new jobs will be in climate mitigation. But that's my view.
I wrote a rather tongue-in-cheek piece, which was when we have structural unemployment, the savior of the day will be the people who want to take us to Mars, in which case you'll have indentured servitude to build new colonies.
Yeah. But then hopefully we'll get new Martian economics, which
that's
be,
it, yeah. Yeah, and let's hope those Martian economics are
Kim's
different than what we have today.
That's great. As these spindly weaklings climb up or sort of crawl off of the spaceship that they've been on for 3 years, and they've been irradiated, and they're going to be gasping for air in a place that doesn't have any.
These are just
atmosphere.
Technical solutions. Like I would go to Mars in a heartbeat. I know Theo's probably with me as well. I would do a 2-year stint on Mars.
That's a 1-year trip. Well, how would you come back? Oh boy, this is a whole different episode that we're about to embark on. Hey, Theo, man, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. I really get a kick out of it.
Likewise.
Thanks for doing it.
Well, we certainly went full futurist, which I love. I love when we get sci-fi on the podcast.
All right. Well, Theo, where can people find you on
Theo.
the web if they want to read about your stuff?
I've got a Medium blog at Theo. It's called. I've got a Substack called Theology. That I've kind of written some pieces on artificial intelligence, and I mainly annoy everybody on Twitter and LinkedIn.
Fabulous.
That's great branding, though, man. Theology. I love that. That's cool. You said that was a challenge. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Theo Priestley, it's been great to have you on the Futurist this week. Thanks for joining us. And a big round of thanks to the folks at Provoke Media that make this show possible, including our engineer, Kevin Hirshhorn, who does a great job of making us sound intelligent and cutting out the stuff where we screw up and mix up and have a technical glitch. And our producer, Elizabeth. Thank you all very much for your help and support. And thanks to our audience for listening. The people who've been listening to the show have been great. The feedback's been positive. The audience is growing. We love that. Keep sending your suggestions.
Number one, baby. Number one. The number one futurist podcast in the world.
Nice.
Thank you all very much. And next week, we will be back with yet another Futurists on the Futurist Show. And so I guess, Fred, it's time for us to do our classically fumbled outro here, where I will see you in the future. Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.